Good afternoon. I'm Sylvester Johnson, the Director of the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Humanities Faculty Research Colloquium. I want to thank Dominique Francesca, the Business Manager of the Center for Humanities, and Joe Fort, the Director of the Athenaeum, for their work in organizing this event. And I want to remind our audience that we'll have a Q&A about half past the hour. So you may send us your questions or comment at any time. If you're joining us through the Zoom app, you can click that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and provide those questions to us. Now, we're delighted to have with us today Dr. Balbir Singh. Dr. Singh is Assistant Professor of Cultural Theory and Digital Media in the Department of Religion and Culture at Virginia Tech, and is also a core faculty member in the Alliance for Social, Political, Ethical, and Cultural Thought PhD program. Dr. Singh is also a faculty affiliate in Women's and Gender Studies at Virginia Tech. And before coming to VT, she was an Embry Family Foundation postdoc fellow in the Center for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. We are delighted that she is here to share her work with us today, and we look forward to engaging with you. Thanks very much for joining us, Dr. Singh.
It's my pleasure. I'm going to share my screen right now. And thanks to everyone who's here. All right. Good afternoon. Thank you, Sylvester, for the invitation to speak with you all, as well as your kind introduction. And thank you to Dominique for handling the logistics, accompanying, making such an event possible. I appreciate you all attending as well, and I am excited to share some of my work with you today. Before I get started, I want to preface my talk with a brief land acknowledgement. The Tutelo-Monacan people are the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live. We recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that Virginia Tech consumes. We pay respect to the Tutelo-Monacan nations and to their elders, past, present, and emerging. An argument for opacity understands the world through antagonism. Such antagonism might be better understood in the name of both ongoing colonialism on the one hand and rising and rampant fascism on the other. I take heed from Black Martinician anti-colonial thinker Edouard Glissant as the singular voice in defining and theorizing opacity as an anti-colonial strategy. In his renowned work, Poetics of Relation, published in translation from the French in 1997, Glissant opens his essay For Opacity as such. Quote, several years back, if I made the statement, we demand the right to opacity, or argued in favor of this, whoever I was speaking to would exclaim indignantly, now it's back to barbarism. How can you communicate with what you don't understand, end quote. Immediately, Glissant states that such a response would instead arouse curiosity in the present, then 1989, which would help propel his argument against the grasp of understanding. It is vital to note that such a demand for the right to opacity, with the swift colonial response placing opacity alongside barbarism and inferring then that understanding and communication are placed alongside civilization, speaks to the distinctly anti-colonial position of opacity. Glissant's thesis here elucidates what it means to think with and for opacity and against the grasp of understanding, visibility, and transparency. I begin here as a way of not only thinking with and for opacity, but thinking too against the grasp, against capture. It is necessary for me to account for the multiple registers of the grasp that Glissant nods to within his essay, while extending such theorizing to the realms of the image, representation, and contemporary art. For Glissant, the grasp is and becomes many things. From the conceptual to the concrete, the grasp and grasping ranges from understanding and knowing another to, as Glissant puts it, the quote, gesture of enclosure, if not appropriation, end quote. In my reading, the grasp takes many forms, from perception to occupation, from absorption to seizure. In its sensorial and intellectual registers, the grasp can be read through the haptic, the feeling and literal hold, the ontological as a mode of comprehension, or the visual of the seen and visible. It has theoretical resonance with interpolation, conceptual similarities with the politics of representation, and can speak to the many ways that assimilation operates as the grasp of white supremacy. It is through an argument against the grasp and against capture that I spend time theorizing today. It is a study for opacity alongside the logics of non-transparency, illegibility, forms of cover, forms of armor, the obscure, the unintelligible, the thick, the saturated, and the dark. Such a brief overview today will read opacity specifically through forms of dress and fashion, particularly by those within the realms of contemporary art and direct action. I find the work of material culture, specifically of garments and textiles, to be particularly salient medium in which to think about the dual forms of physical and material opacity with the conceptual and lived possibilities of counter-surveillance, abolition, and survivance. My investment in contending with the imaginative capacities of opaque matter and dress is part of my reading of such contemporary work and projects through their figurations as forms of sacred and anti-colonial armor. Such theorizing arrives out of my larger research project, my first book manuscript in progress, Militant Bodies, Racial Religious Opacity, and Minoritarian Self-Defense. This object-oriented study is rooted in questions that center post-9/11 racial, gendered, and religious hyperpolicing of Muslim and Sikh bodies. Through politics of dress, hair, and adornment, I interrogate the related racial, gendered, and queer life of hijabi and turbaned bodies to analyze the twinned expansion of both contemporary Islamophobia and global surveillance culture. Using visual material, textiles, text, performance, and media, Militant Bodies theorizes how opacity becomes a necessary lens with which to study the matter and material that has come to define particular racialized bodies in the contemporary. In reading Garb, I highlight how the politics of dress and bodily display are necessary sites of feminist inquiry. I extend this argument to study how hair, too, is quintessential to this fixation, making distinctions between the sacred and secular, nature and artifice, tradition and modernity. I rethink how forms of opacity through adornment and cover are simultaneously apprehended and articulated as forms of minoritarian self-defense. That is, protection from the political climate and its wearing down of Black and Brown peoples writ large. Bridging Asian, Arab, and Black diaspora studies, visual culture, and transnational feminisms, I interrogate the position of bodies within and outside of Muslim, Sikh, Arab, African, and Asian migrations to North America. Chapters situate each object at hand by laying the groundwork for understanding long-standing and contemporary conditions of racist, colonial, and Islamophobic policing, harm, and violence, while centering the work of contemporary artists and direct action practitioners, challenging and resisting these violent material conditions. Moreover, Militant Bodies studies opacity in both literal and abstract senses as a mode in which to theorize forms of coverage, modesty, and what I name divine adornment. It is through such an argument that opacity is a form of liberation from the overwhelming imperative for individual transparency and the regimes against privacy in the global surveillance state. By rendering such a concept through the terms of unknowing, inscrutability, illegibility, and non-transparency, I arrive at how thinking about how autonomy and forms of self-determination become possible. This is how I define opacity as a militant strategy. In my own usage of the term, I am thinking both literally through material forms of cover as the evasion of particular forms of capture on the one hand, as well as abstractly, as in my investment in opacity, is a militant strategy that connotes forms of autonomy and liberation from the colonial surveillance state. For the purposes of my talk today, I will provide a snapshot of my own research on opacity, contemporary art, and forms of dress for racialized and religious communities as a means of engaging two generative and experimental works. First, I examine work by queer South Asian Muslim artist Basira Khan in her 2017 to 2019 project Acoustic Sound Blanket as both textile and performance, speaking to forms of gendered privacy and silence. And secondly, I analyze the collaborative non-commercial clothing line Paradise Sportif by contemporary artists Nep Sidhu and Nicholas Gownin for the modes in which they create indigenous futurist armor. I close with a synthesis of how such work exemplifies the evasion of racial and colonial capture through the production of opaque anti-colonial armor. Acoustic Sound Blanket is a breathtaking example of the sensorial experience of opacity in multiple registers. While the politics and ethics of opacity arrives through vision as out of sight, its original theorization by Glissant is overwhelmingly ontological, which aids in reading Khan's work here. I begin with Basira Khan's work as a way of apprehending how such a project as textile, sculpture, and performance deftly places opacity in conceptual conversation with silence and interiority. While exhibited in a number of solo and group exhibitions, Khan's project is particularly well-defined as such within her placement in the 2020 Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibition, Sound Off, Silence, and Resistance. A description of the work in the accompanying catalog states, quote, "This work takes two forms in the exhibition, a hanging sculpture and documentation of that sculpture in use as its own silent protest during the 2017 Women's March in Washington Square Park. On the wall, it hangs just inches from the ground, ready for use again at any moment. But its use is not solely utilitarian, not only to protect the wearer from rubber bullets, tear gas, and racial profiling at protests. It also asks us to contemplate what protection can look like for Muslim BIPOC femme communities and what honoring opacity, silence, and a right to interiority could look like. The intricate gold embroidery around the opening reminds us that this self-protection is never only utilitarian, but also sacred." End quote. Such explication allows for some significant analysis. Khan's project is multifold in its aims, from its performative application in the crowds of the major 2017 protest, from operating as sculpture hanging inches from the ground, and the textile itself as sacred self-protection. Its material composition is overwhelmingly Black and thick. In her essay, Silence Wielded, within the aforementioned 2020 exhibition catalog for Sound Off, Samira Yamin describes the makeup as, quote, "felted industrial sound insulation blankets, altered with a hole framed in custom gold silk embroidery in the middle," end quote. Yamin, too, makes note of the embroidered patterns on the sound blankets as their distinguishing characteristic, each of them reminiscent of the cover designs of the Quran. The blankets themselves hearken to the construction of various forms of gendered Muslim cover, most notably the niqab and burqa. Given Khan's background as a queer South Asian Muslim femme and her explicit engagement with her Muslim identity, such hearkening is intentional. That is to say that the acoustic sound blanket's composition is meant to signify beyond its titular construction as a sound blanket, and instead does the work of speaking to many different relational readings. Specifically, such a project places questions of Muslim femme cover, including modesty, ornamentation, and Orientalist tropes, in conversation with questions of privacy. Certainly, such a relation between gendered Muslim cover and privacy is familiar in terms of Muslim feminist discourse from scholars including Leila Ahmed, Leila Abu Lagod, and Alora Shebadun, as well as within other scholarly and public cultural discourses centering gender, religion, and empire. Even still, such work desires to place this conversation as beyond the overwhelming sensorial fixation with the visual, bringing to bear how auditory sensation functions as another realm within normalized invasions of privacy. Given Kahn's explication of its felt, visual, and auditory impacts, the dampening of sound within the context of protest in particular invokes the ways such subjection to the environment in terms of sound to be one such mode of sensorial overwhelm and threat. Building on what queer and visual studies scholar Ronak Kapadia names sensuous affiliations, I'm taken by Kahn's project generating another mode in which to figure the possible utility of such sound blankets, given the way that oral onslaught is often used as forms of torture in carceral spaces of detention. Most of all, in this additional sensorial register, Kahn's sound blankets further an argument about the threat of the environment on our senses, designing work that provides modes of managing the visceral effects of such threats. To be clear, I argue that Kahn's project possesses a vitality all its own, most notably in its ability to translate particular ideas in multiple registers. What is more, the gold silk embroideries work reflecting forms of Islamic geometric design is provocative, revealing the mode in which such a garment can be read as sacred self-protection. While certainly the form of the garment as blanket-like, as enveloping the body in black opaque material, can be read in the vein of a burqa or niqab, it is the hole for the head opening surrounded by such geometric embroidery that the piece is transformed into something else. Nevertheless, it is an overwhelmingly Muslim form of art and design. In particular, the embroidery is evocative for Kahn, as each design was chosen for its relation to distinct moments in her youth and young adulthood, ceremonial and sacred moments for family and community. Such forms of designs resonance with covers of Islamic Qurans, the quintessential holy book of the Muslim faith, are intentional and speak to the power of such forms of sacred geometric design. And here I present a small selection of Quran cover designs to show the overwhelming use for gold for the design. And I should note the predominance of Black covers despite my choices here. For most viewing Kahn's work, such gold embellishment is identifiable as Islamic design. This kind of artistry was developed as a way of creating forms without the use of human figures, as such figures are prohibited in sacred Muslim spaces. In such geometry, the illustrator or artist begins with a circle in a square, adding to it a compass that is eventually erased by the end of the design's creation. The addition of lines and circles create distinct patterns that have helped codify this form of geometric design as quintessentially Muslim. These sacred patterns are recognizable on the covers of Qurans, as we see here, as well as on the tessellations or tilings of mosques, madrasas, and palaces, and here as embroidery on Kahn's acoustic sound blanket. What is more, Kahn's performance donning sound blankets in New York City at the 2017 Women's March, held in cities and towns across the globe as one of the largest mass demonstrations resisting authoritarianism, and specifically the ascent of the 45th US president, was documented as part of this project. For the purposes of performance, Kahn did not show her face and instead used the sound blankets as a way of interacting with others anonymously. Many fellow protesters asked for photos with the blanketed Kahn, who obliged, one such shown here. What is more, this particular navigation of a site of political protest inflects the performance with further questions around what it means to desire privacy and interiority in public space, or to insulate oneself in view of the public. Such performance offers additional comment on the Western division of public and private spheres, lending a subaltern perspective of forms of privacy and opacity in the outdoors. In other version of Kahn's performance, she uses bare extremities like her arms and legs as overt displays of her body, sans head. Through her headlessness, her play with modesty here is intentional, as the forms of ornamentation and of the blanket itself conjures the figure of Khan's Muslima or Muslim femme figure. By playing with concealment and revelation here, Khan is signaling to audience her own countervalent art and performance practice. It is with Acoustic Sound Blanket that I find Khan's engagement with the intersectional political and ethical questions of sacred cover and sensorial armor deeply compelling and a pivotal work shaping Muslim North American contemporary art writ large. I turn now to process and develop further the theory of opacity through work emerging out of the multidisciplinary artist collective, Black Constellation. Having formed in 2010, Black Constellation is comprised of many artists working in many forms. Seattle-based hip-hop duo Shabazz Palaces, members Ishmael Butler and Tende Marer, shown here. Musicians Eric Blood, Erica Badu, and The Satisfaction. Visual artists Khalil Joseph, Makoyo Ali Barnes, Nicholas Gallanin, and Nep Sidhu. Specifically, my focus will be on the collaborative work of contemporary multimedia artists from the predominantly Black collective, including Indigenous Tlingit Alaskan Nicholas Gallanin and UK-born Punjabi Sikh Toronto-based Nep Sidhu. I find their frequent collaborations a testament to their bonds and relations between First Nations peoples and the northern Indian state of Punjab and the Sikh religious community. Gallanin and Sidhu created a non-commercial clothing line as part of their visual and textile practice called Paradise Sportif. This line, created by two male-identifying artists, centers the exaltation of what they name the divine feminine. In such works and textile construction, their pieces combine the beauty and artistry of their collaborative talents with a reverence for their respective cultures and ancestral traditions. The use of myriad forms, including deep and dark hues, symbols significant to cultures their own and those within the collective, coverage that is full, intricate, and extravagant. In seeing Paradise Sportif as working with both adornment and garments, part of protection, enhancement, and ceremony, the work of Gallanin and Sidhu is pushing the bounds of what constitutes both fashion and armor. Of their 2016 show, No Pigs in Paradise, at the Simon Fraser University Gallery in Surrey, British Columbia, critic and curator Nagara Kadumu writes, quote, No Pigs in Paradise speaks to an understanding of the specific histories of First Nations women and a clear understanding of women as essential to the restoration of First Nations societies. First Nations women are reaffirmed as the integral component to the reestablishment of balance and harmony. The path exists and the end goal is clear. The right path in this instance starts with protecting the women, leveraging ornament, textile, ceremony, incantation, so they can be prepared to lead their families, communities, and societies to an exalted, harmonious, and prosperous status quo, end quote. I find such a rationale vital for thinking ever more rigorously about such a form of opacity through what I name in my book project, Divine Adornment. By honing in on the lives, struggles, and significance of First Nations women, Gallanin and Sidhu are precisely offering garments that function as forms of armor that are at once centering the integral role of the feminine in Indigenous cultures, as well as venerating their bodies through garments both ceremonious and ornamental. In providing more precision, divine adornment is therefore about aspects sacred and ancestral, offering traditions and histories as part of their fortification. The very fibers of the garments making up such works are crafted with such qualities. In other words, such qualities are what comprise their divinity, and such divinity confers onto such garments forms of what I continue to theorize as opacity. Here, I build on Anne Cheng's recent theory of ornamentalism as, in part, quote, an elegant alchemy of things in person, end quote. And I am invested in reading Paradise Sportif through the sacred qualities of the garments, their relations to histories and genealogies of Indigenous exaltation, and their lack of transparency to such relations for those outside of the constellation, outside of the Tlingit, out of the know. What is more quintessential to Paradise Sportif's opaque qualities are its very non-commercial nature, insofar as it offers no way for donning such forms of dress and adornment to those outside of Black constellation. Further, Paradise Sportif's work as an out of circulation and its very unavailability to the demands of the capitalist market helps put in relief the generally illegible lines of relation across such work, through such practice, and for such ceremony. In some ways, like many subaltern and visual and artistic forms, its opacity arrives to the public as one that necessarily asks more questions than it answers, helping to produce a kind of anxiety for a gaze that desires forms of understanding and visual comprehension. Such an anxiety generally presents itself through forms of consumption and ownership as a symbol of supposed affinity and a grasp of the work. Working against such a grasp, I offer two of their adorned figures here. In one of their more iconic pieces from the Paradise Sportif line, Galanin and Sidhu offer an indigenous futurist design chilcot coat titled She in Mud Form. It is a mustard yellow chilcot robe with a train adorned with indigenous symbology and totemic figures. A chilcot robe or blanket is a quintessential form of clinket dress, and its usage as the base of the piece demonstrates its homage to tradition, melding with its overall futurist design. Its train is comprised of multiple brown puffer jackets, a nod to the icy climates of Sitka, Alaska, and Toronto across the northern region of Turtle Island, the puffer's coat color connoting its reference to the mud and to the earth. The grandeur of the chilcot coat's collar is comprised of an intricate gold applique, geometrically placed. Alone, it conjures a sleek futurism in its enclosure, and even still is complemented by a hem that is angular with black and ivory tassels woven with careful geometric patterning. The chilcot's totem is placed toward the bottom of the coat. The red, blue, and brown are striking complements to the mustard of the coat, and the totem is clinket in design as they have their own distinctive art style that centers animals, including birds, wolves, ravens, salmon, as well as killer and humpback whales. The colors are quintessential to the clinket, as are the design of the eye and avian style figures. In many ways, the clinket design is how indigenous art appears across the Pacific Northwest, and its display on such a futurist garment provides a kind of creative cultural testament to the survival and vitality of First Nations people under the violence of ongoing settler colonialism. The attention to detail and the level of intricacy help to outline the kind of materiality that is at the center of a theory of divine adornment. In this work, we see indigenous futurism designed with First Nations women at the center, emerging from the earth, exalted and enshrined in such a garment. In a second piece from Paradise Sportif, Galanin and Sidhu give us a figure draped in a fur cloak on both sides and atop their head, with the figure themselves adorned in a dress of beads and braids. The style is notably and infinitely divine, the otherworldly quality composed of indigenous materials and crafts. The coloring from the beige, brown, gold fur cloak, the predominantly black braiding with the long train of red braiding attached, and the beading of red, beige, gold, blue attached to the braided covering of the head and chest of the figure. The usage of fur is a particular nod to the First Nations forms of covering in the colder climates, a way of honoring the entirety of animals slain through hunting practices. Above all, there is an immense awe in witnessing such textile-based sculptures. The fuller coverage of both of these figures, too, is part of the formal qualities of divine adornment, offering fuller protection from the climate of antagonism, whether through forms of weathering or more general human forms of enmity. Such garments and embellishments imbue such pieces with sacred properties and qualities. In designing for Native women specifically, Galanin and Sidhu are mindful of not only the centrality of First Nations women to their communities, but to their plight in the Canadian context of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. By intentionally creating work for First Nations women, not only do Galanin and Sidhu honor and exalt their divine feminine figures, but they too recognize the kinds of ongoing genocidal practices the state enacts on Indigenous women, making manifest minoritarian self-defense through divine adornment. While remaining within the realm of contemporary art and with Indigenous futurism in mind, Galanin and Sidhu's material cultural practice is a form of indirect yet active political participation in seeking forms of justice and reparations for First Nations women. Galanin and Sidhu's collaboration within and beyond Paradise Sportif conjures other kinds of ghostly or spectral connections. Galanin's role as an Indigenous artist and Sidhu's collaborator is important in understanding their exchange of knowledge as their work emerges out of complex histories, belief systems, and spiritual relations that are made known or better known to one another through their process of collaboration. For example, I think of Galanin's background as Tlingit, an Indigenous Alaskan, and of Sidhu's background as Sikh, as Punjabi, and as a diasporic subaltern subject. There are spectral resonances, ones that connote the kinds of legacies of violence perpetrated on these distinctive communities. For one, Sidhu's work often incorporates hair as part of its multimedia composition. Hair holds a special significance for Sikhs, as it is often kept unshorn to express a devotion to Sikhi. Many Sikhs have long hair and often use forms of cover for it, most notably in the case of the turban. For many Indigenous peoples, especially First Nations communities, hair is also kept and maintained as an expression of a connection to the natural world. Often for Native peoples, hair is shorn only in times of mourning as it represents profound loss, and subsequently its regrowth demonstrates spiritual and natural movement forward from that loss. I think too of the braiding of long hair for Sikhs and First Nations peoples, how braiding appears in their collaborative craft. What is more, I am further reminded of the history of scalping that haunts both communities, their hair used against them by repressive states like India, the United States, and Canada. It is through such veneration and reverence on the one hand, and such violence and trauma on the other hand, that we can see how Galanin and Sidhu come to their work in collaboration within Black Constellation in the sharing of their worlds, Native and Sikh, red and brown, Indigenous and subaltern. In so doing, this meeting of aesthetics and politics in Paradise Sportif aids in forwarding a theory of divine adornment. Such a theory extends my own thinking through opacity, necessarily complicating what it means to evade forms of racial and colonial capture in favor of producing garments that celebrate tradition and the sacred pasts and futures of Indigenous peoples. I am invested in how these garments center forms of full coverage, protection from the elements, and often provide a shrouding of the head and body of its possible wearer. It helps to further delineate my investment in opacity as not necessarily concerned with modesty versus ostentation, but instead with the qualities of armor, of protection, of the desire to make the body unavailable or less available to harm. It is through this futurist, non-commercial collection of garments and ornaments that Galanin and Sidhu construct a visionary form of Indigenous self-defense. I close my talk today synthesizing some of these questions and notions of opacity through the production of garments through fashion as armor. By way of studying Basira Khan's acoustic sound blanket and Nicholas Galanin and Nep Sidhu's non-commercial clothing line, Paradise Sportif, my investment in theorizing opacity maintains its core tenet as a militant strategy of life and survival for BIPOC peoples. It is a political and aesthetic tactic that understands the chances of living are about the chances of not getting got. By this, I mean to underscore my investment in evading the grasp that Glissant notes in his early anti-colonial theorizing for opacity, while also necessarily emphasizing how such a phrase is about escaping harm, violence, and murder. Even further, such a phrase emphasizes the necessity in eluding the state and most especially the police. The works engaged here today are concerned about the life and survival of minoritarian communities. The figure of a Muslimah in performance and protest, in private, in public, escaping visual and oral invasions of privacy, and the sacred garments honoring the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls at the hands of the white settler police state. Such a brief set of analyses has hopefully provided a snapshot of my own approach to the study of contemporary art and theory through the militant strategy of opacity. Given the concerns in my book project, Militant Bodies, specifically in its object orientation, I should note my works focus today on artists and practitioners challenging the overwhelming discursive and material violence as it manifests through Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Blackness, and settler colonialism. Using Lisa Lowe's rendering of historical intimacies across lands and oceans, the respective work studied today demonstrates the kinds of political and ethical commitments essential to building futures for the study and horizons of racial justice through the domains of art and visual culture, specifically understanding the stakes of creative cross-pollination in order to enact practices of care and solidarity with other BIPOC communities. What is more, I see the study of opacity given such forms of sacred dress as a necessary reworking of how we might better understand the tensions of the sacred and secular as uniquely racialized. Ultimately, the triangulation of opacity with my book's investment in concepts of minoritarian self-defense and divine adornment contends with the forms of racial and colonial capture all too common in the contemporary. It is my argument that opacity as a theory and creative militant strategy is a dream for other worlds, wherein liberation connotes rest from lives lived on the run, evading, escaping, and shaking off the grass. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was a really fascinating analysis of a number of different elements that you have woven together, I think, in a very rich fashion. Want to remind our audience that you are welcome to offer your questions or comments, responses. And if you're joining through the Zoom app, you can click that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can send us your questions or comments right there. And I was wondering if we might begin with you talking about a couple of elements here. So of course, as you mentioned, this talk rose out of the book that you're writing now, and you are bringing to the forefront the work of Indigenous artists and sartorial design, fashion. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate on something that you raised multiple times implicitly in the paper that you shared with us, why it's important to include attention to fashion and aesthetics when studying critical responses to racial colonial systems. I think it's probably more familiar for people to think of organized politics or even armed resistance or some much more explicit economic systems in ways of responding to systems of domination. It would be easy to think about fashion in a pure sense of leisure, for example, but you're bringing into focus a different element of sartorial practices and design by explicating the role that this can play in systems of resistance. So can you say more about how you came to that understanding of sartorial practices and what's at stake in trying to make that visible for your readers and for your audience?
Yeah, thank you, Sylvester. It's very generous and yeah, just a really engaged question. So I appreciate that. I mean, for me, these kinds of questions, I kept coming back to the fact that, part of it is like this sort of obsession with the ocular, the visual, the visible, right, through studies of surveillance. And so for me, as someone who's also like trained in anti-colonial thinking and really, starting from that place, even like as an undergraduate, I think there was a lot of questions that always came up around what the effects viscerally are on a corporeal level, right? What's felt by the body, right? And so in terms of questions around safety and security for communities that are affected by these bigger questions, right? Supposedly, for instance, like national security and questions of domestic security. So for me, I think the body is what I always continue to come back to as the site in which to really think about forms of precarity, vulnerability, and what it means to express forms of, I mean, we could call it resistance, or we could call it, for me, a lot of it is like these countervalence projects, or if they're thinking about, questions of what it means to watch back, or to use like Simone Brown's concept of dark surveillance, right? Like there's all of this richness that comes from looking at projects that are thinking about modes of resistance that take different forms, right? And so for me, fashion, forms of design and aesthetics are one such realm in which there is just so much richness in terms of the ways that people from these communities are responding, right? And collaborating with other communities. Like for me, I think, the second sort of project that I look at with, these two very distinct artists working on this really exciting collaborative clothing line, I think just continue to sort of underscore for me what is so vital about and exciting about the kind of ways that they are thinking about fashion as armor. And this is a sort of refrain in my own work of like, what do we mean when we think about these kinds of projects in terms of like this very, this relationship between this matter and material and the body itself, what it can do to protect oneself. In a longer version of this talk, I also included another project that looks at DIY bulletproof wearables, right? And so there's this other sort of like side of this part of this book project that I'm thinking, and working through and writing and closer every day to getting it done, but really thinking about the ways that artists and direct action practitioners are understanding this sense of it always coming back to the body, right? And also creating ways of doing that in collaboration and together, and thinking about different kinds of minoritarian like forms of vulnerability and precarity. And I think you're right. I think it's great that you point out that like fashion and aesthetics are looked to as through leisure, right? Or through, I mean, even, fashion, a lot of it is thinking of it like fashion oftentimes means high fashion for a lot of folks, and it means luxury. And for me, I want to emphasize the ways that there are these really exciting minoritarian practices and forms of minoritarian aesthetics that are thinking otherwise and thinking beyond more limited definitions of these very, to me, expansive categories that really do directly speak and are in conversation in a very political way, right? So I'm always sort of interested in that question of the political and aesthetic as something that necessarily are speaking to one another.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of one of the first encounters I had with your work, in which you were really, in a very compelling way, explaining the digital technology that's used in drone warfare as a very important aspect of digital media. And usually when we think of digital media, if you just ask an audience about it, we might think of the internet or social media or watching a film. And those are examples of digital media. But in that particular episode of your work, you were examining warfare and drone technology, which is very much dependent on digital platforms and the visual experience of a target or some object of surveillance or of a strike to kill that subject, that person, relayed through software systems. And it's a very high-tech environment. And so I was reminded of that as I was listening to you talk about fashion this way, because it's a very compelling analysis, but it just strikes me as an approach to the material that is not necessarily intuitive, for most observers. And so I'm wondering if you could see, these are two specimen or exempla I offer as ways that you have evidenced the way that you bring attention to your subject material. That's not a typical reading. It's not the typical lens that most researchers might bring to this. And I think that's terrific and exciting and compelling, but also curious about what has informed the way you approach material and the kinds of questions or the style of questions that you ask. To you, it might feel second nature or natural, but it's not uh, usually the kind of questions and interrogation that scholars might bring to this material. So what informs your purview or the way that you usually hold a lens of analysis to the material that lies at the center of your research?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that question as well, Sylvester. I mean, I think, it's been a long time for me to get to this place of like, when you get to a book project, it's informed for me by so much that is really like deeply personal and felt to me on a communal level, like thinking about, for me, how this project is very much militant bodies, that is very much, it's about a sort of post 9/11 context. It is looking at a lot of very contemporary work. And for me, a lot of these questions stemmed from, just even these earlier moments as just part of the Sikh community, seeing, members of my own community, those who don turbans, deciding that they needed to make their turbans red, white, and blue to cohere to sort of this national imagination around what it means to be a good citizen subject, so that they're not read, through this lens of mistaken identity that was so common for the Sikh community, right? And so this distinction that kept happening between Muslims and Sikhs was really sort of troublesome and troubling to me. And so this is where, for me, thinking about the politics of solidarity, something that I'm so informed by, especially because I am sort of trained in ethnic studies and particularly Asian and Arab American studies. I mean, really thinking about how this very much like, from the time I'm like in high school, sort of seeing the fallout from 9/11 to like where this project has come in terms of thinking about how the hijab and turban are centered as ways that I orient my project. And so for me, I think it also comes back to this question of like, I lay the terrain of like really thinking about the violence and forms of harm, indignity, forms of annihilation that have happened since 9/11 for these communities, but also thinking about the sort of like ways that my own work is very much formed by my interdisciplinary training, my sort of engagements with feminist theory, particularly my encounters with like Muslim feminisms, which, I teach this to my students too. And, oftentimes reading Abu Lughod, like really being like, Muslim feminisms is a thing. It's not a contradiction. It is in fact a rich and longstanding scholarly and cultural conversation. And so for me, it's informed by all of these things that I've brought to bear a lot of that in terms of how I come to this work. And I think, ultimately, like, especially with this short snapshot for today, like this is how a lot of things are playing out with my own project, is because for me, I see the infinite possibilities of looking at work like Basira Khan's work, or looking at Nep Sidhu and Nicholas Gallin's work. And like, for me, I'm just so inspired by that kind of work and reading it with care and like the absolute awe that I see it with, because I think there's just a lot in terms of the kinds of ways that this is sort of understood as one possible way of responding to these forms of violence and degradation and sort of the genocidal impulses of the state. And so for me, I think the way that I approach matter and material, right, through objects and through art, really comes back to thinking about these sort of like long-standing debates. And to me, like a lot of it has to do with thinking against surveillance. I mean, I think of how I'm thinking through opacity is like in line with how there's a lot of really unique and compelling work on fugitivity. Like there's a lot of resonance I see with other ethnic studies fields like Black studies, Indigenous studies, and obviously with my own work within Asian American and Arab American studies. And so, yeah, I mean, it's very much informed by all of that. And I don't know, for me, I'm like, the way you're saying that it's atypical, I'm like, I don't know. That's like the only way I know how to think, right? Is like, it's just how it comes out for me. And yeah, I don't know. I cull from a lot of different things because I'm like someone who is, I guess, infinitely curious about other things and just other forms of study, other forms of engagement. And so, yeah, I think it's just this like constant curiosity that drives me to sort of see things like as a constellation. That's part of why I love Black constellation, because they are using constellation as a way of being like, there are relations between these things and I will do that work. But it is like building with those folks who are doing this work and doing so with, you know, a care and respect for that work. So yeah, I don't know. That's a very sort of me answer, but
Yeah,
it's
no, that's what we're going for. And I think it certainly makes sense. Hopefully your engagement with material and the lens you have on it should feel natural. Otherwise, it's not you, right? You're just trying to impose something from somewhere else. But it's also interesting to reflect on what informs the different approaches. And I think that it is a great testament to the importance even of creativity. So we don't always associate creativity to disciplines that don't have the legibility of creative arts. But I'm always reminded that you can never study what you can't imagine. If you can't think of it, you can't study. Right? But you have to have enough creativity to understand relationships that exist in ways that aren't already mapped for you. So that you can see those connections. So anyhow, I just think you've demonstrated that very compellingly in the work that you've shared with us. And you've also been talking about surveillance society. So this is a very important undercurrent by way of context for the material that you're looking at, the histories that you're studying, and the frameworks and analyses that you're setting forth for us. Can you share in a few sentences some of the most important differences that are made when a society is a surveillance society? And you've done this in other contexts, given us this is really easy for you to do, but could you kind of a couple of examples of what you mean by surveillance society?
Yeah.
And then it makes a profound difference. You've been giving us some of those evidences. But could you, in a more casual way, just kind of relay for us some of the differences that it makes when surveillance is so central to how a society works? But a couple of examples, and then why this changes things.
Yeah. I mean, let me just make sure. So you, in terms of like, so examples of like how we live in a surveillance society, right? So I mean, one big way I'm thinking is like just the basic, like you're driving through a town and, you know, you can be a lot, and this is, you know, for me, even when I teach. So one class I'm teaching right now is an undergraduate class called Policing Dress Bodies. And I ask students this exact question of like, how do you understand surveillance in a really general, broad way? And one big way immediately I always get within like the first few answers is you're driving too fast, police car, you see it and you're like, you know, you're being tracked. I mean, we're being tracked also by cameras that will oftentimes take a picture if you're going too fast, right? And so that's like a really sort of like one basic way we can understand surveillance is like, you know, part of how we understand a police car that might be tracking you while you're driving, or a camera that's also watching you. Cameras themselves, right, which we see in neighborhoods everywhere, but heavily, we see, you know, heavy camera surveillance in particular neighborhoods, particularly in urban spaces, and more of a concentration of that. And so understanding that. I also, you know, always have to remind students that like when you go into a store, like, or even like a post office or a library, like anywhere, right, any government building, cameras are everywhere. So that's a big, maybe obvious example of surveillance. I mean, we see footage on the local news all the time that shows us, if there's supposed criminal activity, you have the footage. That footage is important for everything. Now we have things like body cameras, right, for police that are not forms of surveillance, but are supposed to be. I don't know if we can understand them as counter surveillance. It's very tricky because it's very complicated. Simone Brown writes much more excitingly about this, but really thinking about how cameras themselves are forms of surveillance. We even think about, like, for me on my computer, how I cover my camera with like 2 pieces of tape to make sure that, understanding how privacy works right now, thinking about how that's something that can, this idea of you are always being watched, right? Like the kinds of paranoia that instills. And so I think those are some like basic-ish ways of understanding like how we live and carrying our phones with us. We have something that's, I don't know. Now I'm like, okay, keep going, but I don't want to keep going for the sake of time. But like thinking about how, we are in some ways equipped with things that already watch us. And then when we go out in the world, whether it's driving or just walking down the street or going into a building, cameras are everywhere. And so those are major examples, and very obvious examples of surveillance. If you go to the airport, you get screened, right? So these are things that are very obvious forms of surveillance and things that I've talked about previously. But yeah, there's a lot of different examples. And in terms of the second part of your question being like,
how does this change us, right? Because this is one of the conditions that the sartorial design, the fashion design, partly is responding to. Is responding to several things that you laid out to us, but there is that undergirding context of a surveillance society.
Mm-hmm.
Surveillance society, and so it conditions our lives in profound ways. And in your paper, you pointed to those, but just as a way of encapsulating it for our audience in a summary fashion, how might you say that in a very concise way?
Yeah, I guess what is part of what you're saying, right? A big part of it is the self-disciplining, right? And this is something that we can track to Foucault, but when you are being watched and when you know you're being watched, you behave as though you're being watched, right? As though you cannot do something out of the norm, right? And so thinking about how this helps construct norms themselves, what we understand as like proper public behavior, just really basic things. It also, though, instills a sense of like paranoia in us, right? And I think this is something where, just a few hours ago, I screened with my class the film "The Feeling of Being Watched," which looks at a Muslim community in Chicago and their surveillance that predates 9/11. And so a lot of it is the sense of paranoia that can, in many ways, affect not only individual mental health within those folks that are being watched, but also collective communal mental health. So thinking about how surveillance is something that is felt. And this is, again, what I keep coming back to is like, that's why I keep focusing on the felt, the material, the matter, the haptic, all of that, I think is why. I think surveillance's pervasiveness is what makes it really important to understand on a collective communal level, on a bodily individual level, on a sort of mental, affective, psychological level as well. So I guess that's like, I think it's like the self-disciplining paranoia, the ways that those show up in the world, the way that those might turn into mental health crises, which are then responded to by the police. And then that's part of the problem itself, right? Like, I think all of this goes hand in hand. You can't be sort of underemphasized in terms of thinking about surveillance. Yeah.
Well, this is very fascinating work. We thank you again for sharing with us Divine Adornment. Thank you, our audience, for joining us for another of the Humanities Research Faculty Colloquia. And thanks to Dominique Francesca and Joe Ford again for helping us to organize this event. Hope you'll join us next time. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lester. Take care.